We meet on the lands of the Kulin Nation, traditional owners of this place, known to us today as Melbourne, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. My name is Peter Mears. My day job is as presenter of the National Interest on ABC Radio National. Every now and again in the evenings I'm lucky enough to get invited here to the Wheeler Centre to host a conversation, and I'm particularly honoured and pleased to host this evening's event with former Justice of the High Court Michael Kirby about his, it's not a memoir, but his book, A Private Life. Michael Kirby, welcome. I don't need to give a long introduction, but I'll just run through a couple of things. Michael Kirby was a judge on the High Court from 1996 to 2009. I think you were the longest, at the time of your retirement, you were the longest serving judge in Australia. Is that still a record you hold?
Well, so far so good, yes.
And of course he had a long and distinguished legal career, legal and judicial. He's been a university chancellor and had a lot of engagement with university management and oversight, and been very active in the promotion of human rights and human dignity at a national and international level, including his work with the International Commission of Jurists, the World Health Organisation's Global Commission on AIDS, and the UNAIDS Reference Group on HIV and Human Rights. Now, this is not an autobiography, it's rather a series of carefully selected episodes from a rich life. Essays, really, that contain elements of both memoir and social commentary. And at its heart, it's also a charming love story. It's called A Private Life, and Michael Kirby, it's an ironic title. I thought it's an odd title when I saw it because you're such a public figure. Why did you call it A Private Life?
Well, I was trying to product differentiate between A.J. Brown's biography of me, which he spent 7 years combing through all the public material, and this is a sort of the inner story of my life. Everyone in this audience has a private life, a personal life, a life of emotions and deep feelings, and I have those, and some of them I think are useful to share because they tell little stories, and that's how we make progress in the world.
I guess your life was, though, more private. Your personal life was more private than some others.
Well, it had to be in the early days. I had to comply with the rule, don't ask, don't tell. I mean, they were the rules. I knew the rules. Everybody who was around at that time knew the rules, and so long as you stuck to those rules, nobody really made a big fuss. But that's over as far as I'm concerned. So now we're digging deep, but not too deep. I mean, it isn't salacious. Though I'm told by Alvin Unwin I should never say that. You know, I should leave it as a possibility that you're. But I don't think that Johan and my father would approve. So it's not salacious, but it is about my inner life, yes.
Well, let's start at the beginning, if you like. Let's go back to your early childhood and in your first school experiences, because they were clearly important to you.
They certainly were, and I can remember just after, or about the time of the end of the Second World War, 1945, I was in really first class at the infant school at North Strathfield Public School in Sydney. My teacher was Miss Pontifex, which was a very suitable name for such a teacher. I can remember the peculiar smell of the laminated paper on which the alphabet was written, and how I loved that smell. You know, I was probably sort of guilty of some terrible crime of sniffing, and she taught the alphabet. She taught the slope at which you were expected to write. Right from that time, and in those days we had slope cards, which were cards with very dark lines on it showing the slope at which the copperplate style writing we had in those days was. So they were the earliest days, and I pay a tribute in the book and often to my teachers in public schools.
Oh, I can attest to how well you were taught that beautiful copperplate writing, because you just signed my copy of the book. So later on, people can get their own copies signed and
in
fountain
ink.
pen.
Ink?
In ink, yes. Not many of us can even use a fountain pen these days. But your experience, I mean, you loved school, didn't you? You liked school. You wanted to be there. You were eager to learn.
I certainly was. I was eager for those crowns. In those days, if you did very, very well, if you did a very nice essay, you got a crown, the crown of St Edward, St Edward the Confessor. His crown was put on the side of your essay, and a red stamp. And if you were extremely good, you got one on your wrist or on your forehead. And then you would go home and show your parents what happened. And some unkind people have said that I've spent the rest of my life searching for those crowns in life that mark a good job done, another day with a good job done.
At the age of 9, is this correct? 9, I think, you were given a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes, by that stage I was at the Summerhill Opportunity School. They have a system in New South Wales of streaming bright kids chosen by IQ tests, and so I had been selected for that, and I went to a school which is about 5 kilometres from my parents' home. And at that school, Mr. Gorringe, it was 1949, and so the Universal Declaration had been adopted on the 10th of December 48. And Dr. Evatt, an Australian, a past Justice of the High Court, who was at the time the Minister for External Affairs and the President of the General Assembly, he was sitting there and when the Universal Declaration was brought into force. And it may have been him who arranged for these airmail copies to be sent out from Lake Success in New York, where the UN was then based, to Australian schools. And I think everybody in public schools in Australia in 1949 got a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Do you still have your copy?
It's probably there in those 400 yards of archives in the National Archives, or in my father's garage. My father has kept everything from those days, so it's probably still there, but I've certainly got it near my desk in Sydney. And I do remember Eleanor Roosevelt came out to Australia because she came out during the war to open the Concord Repatriation General Hospital, which is a very big hospital. Was built by the Americans for the American troops who were brought home if they were injured, and they would go there. It's now a general hospital in Concord. But
and you grew up very nearby?
Very near there, and she went past the school. And we were all sort of lined up there to see the President's First Lady go past. She was a wonderful person, truly wonderful person. Not only did she chair that committee, but she was foremost in her struggle against racism in the United States. A really great example, and person full of heart. We've all got to be more heart. Lots of mind, but lots of heart too, and she certainly had lots of heart.
What did that mean, that Universal Declaration, that bit of paper you received?
Well, we also had as a poster, it was a poster on the school wall, and our teacher, Mr. Gorringe, taught us that we'd just gone through this terrible war. It's very hard for people now to realise and to see, we're talking about the time of the war and just after the war. First of all, how poor Australia was at that time, and how we'd really sacrificed, and our soldiers had really sacrificed, and how the time was one of great fear, especially fear of atomic weapons, because everybody, when I was growing up, we were very conscious, maybe much more than we are now. Maybe we should be more conscious of the tremendous perils of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and of the fact that unless we could get our act together and get the universal principles and get the United Nations working effectively, then we may not survive. We will be blasted off the planet like the poor people of Hiroshima. So these were the feelings of the time, and I still remember them quite vividly, the feelings of fear but determination to build a better world and to build it on the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Dr. Everett had brought into force and Eleanor Roosevelt had helped to write.
Your experience, as I've said, of school was generally very positive, but you did also have a negative experience, something that I suppose exposed you to the nature of injustice at a very personal level.
Yes, I got the cane. I only got it once, but it was in extremely unjust circumstances, and I'm working out whether or not I've got a cause of action against the Department of
What's
Education.
the statute of limitations, do you think?
Yes, but that's suspended for a time during infancy, and at the time I was an infant, but it came about because the school desks in those days had a little hole, and in them was put a porcelain pot, and in the pot mysterious people came overnight and poured ink, departmental ink. It was blue-black, neither blue nor black, but it was a combination, and you had a nib which you would put in. When you got the nib first, a new nib, you had to lick it in order that it would take friction and take the ink. But anyway, I had spilt ink. Somehow I bumped it, and it bumped onto my departmental exercise book, and I tore the pages out of the exercise book so that I wouldn't literally have a copybook that was blotted. And my teacher, the handsome Mr. Tennant, Warren Tennant from Newcastle, Merriweather Beach, Newcastle, he wasn't there because he would never have done anything like this. The handsome Mr. Tennant, he was injured in a motor car accident, so he was off work. And Mr. Gibbons, who had fought in the First World War, had that special badge of the returned soldiers. Anyway, he was taking the class in default of Mr. Gibbons, and being the headmaster, he had a cane. He was allowed to brandish the cane, and so he came into our class. He was teaching us something. He saw my book. He picked it up. He said, "This book is light. This book is light.
Underweight.
There are pages missing from this book. You have," and I was saying, but, and you've stolen pages from the book. You've torn pages out. This is the King's property. But. And anyway, ultimately, he said, "No buts about it. You've got to come out. 2 of the best for you." And so I put out my hand, and I went back in humiliation. No crown for me that day, only the cane. And I wasn't given a chance to have my say, to explain that my motives were pure. I was just sitting there in humiliation, and it probably made me soft on crime. I was known, when I used to appear, usually presiding in the Court of Criminal Appeal of New South Wales in my brilliant scarlet robes, which now my brother David wears. It was said to be like the scene in Fidelio where the prisoners come up from the dark and throw off their chains, and that's how the prisoners used to come into the Banco Court in Sydney when I came on to sit, and it was all because of Mr. Gibbons. And it also taught me the principle of allowing a person to be heard. I mean, even God allowed Adam to be heard before he banished him from Eden. And Mr. Gibbons wouldn't listen to my explanations. But there we are, I've got over that. Mr. Gibbons he was probably a good teacher. Certainly he was a disciplinarian, but soon the handsome Mr. Tennant came back and all was restored.
You went then on to high school at Fort Street, which of course is another selective school in Sydney under the New South Wales system. And again, a happy experience in high school?
Well, my high school was wonderful, and I had marvellous teachers. And my mother asked me, knowing that it would be decided and announced at the school, she said, "How much do you want if you get to Fort Street. And I immediately thought, now I must ask too much because my parents aren't wealthy, and yet it must be a just reward if I get to Fort Street High School, the oldest.
It was very competitive.
Very competitive, and it's 1849. It's the oldest continuous high school, public high school in the country. The oldest school in the country, I don't know if Melbourne has an older school, is the King's School, which was 1830, but Fort Street was 1849, the first public school. And anyway, I asked for 10 shillings, and ultimately they announced that I had got there, and my mother gave me the 10 shillings. Some unkind people say I've still got that first 10 shillings, but I remember it was on like the first dollar note. It was an orange-coloured note. And the king was on it, King George VI, dressed in the uniform of an admiral of the fleet, and he looked very much like a king. And he was a very good king, King George VI. He was a man who never wanted to be king, but did his duty, which of course is what I take from the system, that you do your duty and you continue doing it whilst you hold an office. Obviously,
at high school you become an adolescent. At some point, you realise you're gay.
Very early. Well, I realised, and I think it even was before high school, actually. I was always precocious.
Very early.
Yes, but anyway, but it was something that under the rules of that time you had to keep very, very quiet. You knew it wasn't a good trip. It was something to be kept very much to yourself. And of course that is the sadness, really, looking back on it, that the people who were closest to you, that really you loved, and they loved you, and you knew that, you had to keep such a discovery entirely to yourself.
Did you confide in anyone?
No one. I had to just work it all out in my own little brain and keep it all to myself. But, you know, in regional or rural Australia today, that is what still happens, and maybe even in this great metropolis, it's something that is awkward and difficult for a child, and awkward and difficult for some parents, but it's getting better, and one of the purposes of this book is to hope to make it a bit better for the next generation.
So you must have struggled with your feelings. I mean, did you feel shame, or did you think there was something wrong with you, or?
Well, I knew I was supposed to feel ashamed and supposed to feel that something was terribly wrong with me, but somehow I couldn't really feel that way. And about this time, I began to read in the papers about the Kinsey report, because the Kinsey report on the sexual response in the human male was written in 1948.
This is Alfred Kinsey, wasn't it?
Yes, Alfred Kinsey, who was the professor of zoology at Indiana University in the United States. He had been the greatest expert in the world on gall wasps. He had millions of samples of gall wasps. He knew everything about the love life of the gall wasp, and he ultimately decided he was going to look into the human sexual response, which, weirdly enough, not many people had ever done. And the astonishing thing that he discovered was that there in rural America, in Indiana, flat Indiana, a certain proportion of people, quite a big proportion actually, had during their lives had a homosexual sexual experience. He tested it by orgasm in the sexual experience. Physical.
That's what counted.
Yeah.
If you'd had an orgasm.
Well, it was an objective sort of a criterion. So he took it, and he found, I think it was something like 30% of males had at least one experience, and then it got down to 10% had for a period of their lives been homosexual, and then 4% were exclusively homosexual lifelong. And I was beginning to look as though I was in the 4%, and so, but just learning about this and learning that this was part of the reality of the world rather confirmed me as a little boy that I wasn't really so weird after all, and that this was just part of the reality. And strangely enough, years and years later, I was invited by Indiana University to serve on the Board of Governors of the Kinsey Institute, and I still serve on their Board of Governors. And I went to Indiana, but it was a very interesting thing. There were a lot of people trying to stop Kinsey doing the research, and this was the McCarthy period in the United States, so a lot of attempts were made to stop him doing his research, and funding was taken away and so on. But there was a marvellous president of the university who, Herman Wells his name was, and Herman Wells said, if Dr. Kinsey's research is properly based in science, it will be done at Indiana University. And so it was done there, and it's still being done there. They've still got the Kinsey Institute there. Herman Wells, I later stayed in his home, because they've got a home on the campus of which they have visitors stay at. And all around the home were photographs of Herman and his mum. Herman never married. Herman's companion was his mother. And I suspect that Herman's support for Dr. Kinsey might have been a little self-interested. I'm sure that never happens with vice-chancellors today. But it was a brave thing that he stood up against Joe McCarthy, who was just up the road, and he authorised and supported the research, and the research showed the facts and the science. And once you get the science, that then becomes really impossible to say these are just a group of evil people who have got a lifestyle. Boy, I hate that word lifestyle. They've got a lifestyle that they're acting out, and they've just got to stop.
Some people choose to live by the beach. Some people choose to be gay. You know, it's a lifestyle choice.
Or some people are interested in South American butterflies or fast cars. You just choose.
Wasps.
Yes, or gore wasps. But anyway, that was Alfred Kinsey,
Alfred Kinsey obviously gave you, as a young man, some comfort, and
an affirmation, really, a sort of affirmation.
You weren't alone.
That I wasn't a weirdo.
Yeah. And the other thing was the Wolfenden Report. Remind us what the Wolfenden Report was.
Well, Sir John Wolfenden was a safe pair of hands. He was another head of a university. He was the head of Reading University, and there'd been a great outcry over a lord. Anything in England that happens generally sort of involves somebody of the nobility, and a lord had somebody come to his home, and there was a young soldier who pinched his watch. And when the lord went to complain to the police about the soldier pinching his watch, the police dug a bit deeper and found that the relationship with the soldier hadn't been entirely pure. And this led to the lord being prosecuted and being sent to jail. And there was a lot of outcry in England at the time, thinking, well, this isn't... He went to the police because his watch was pinched, and he ends up ending up in jail himself. Anyway, that led to a movement in England of people, mainly straight people, heterosexual people, saying we've got to get rid of these laws. And so the movement led ultimately to an inquiry. The inquiry was chaired by Sir John Wolfenden, and the inquiry came up with the proposal that these laws were intruding into an area which, to use the language of the report, is, to put it bluntly, not the law's business. And so that was the recommendation to Parliament in 1957. When I was 17, it was a recommendation, wasn't acted on for 10 years, but in 67 the English repealed the offences, and then we started that 67, and Don Dunstan in South Australia took the step in South Australia in I think 74. Bob Ellicott, the Attorney General in the Fraser government, took the steps for the ACT in 76. And so one by one the Australian states got rid of it until about 1992 or 1996 when Tasmania did, and we now don't have it. But in 41 of the 54 countries of the Commonwealth of Nations, they still have this legacy. It's a very particular legacy of the British Empire.
It doesn't exist so much in countries that were colonised by other powers. It's a particularly British thing.
The French got rid of those laws from Royal France in 1793. In the time of their revolution. They had a revolutionary the states, they got rid of it, and then Napoleon got his codifiers to codify the penal law in 1806, and that didn't contain the law, so that all the French colonies, the Spanish colonies, the Netherlands colonies, the Scandinavian, German, all of them don't have it. Japan, China and so on, which copied those codes, didn't have it. The Netherlands code, criminal code, is still in force in Indonesia, which is the biggest Islamic country in the world in terms of population, and they've never had an offence against homosexuals. It's a very peculiar British thing, and exercising my mind is how at the CHOGM meeting in a few weeks' time, whilst we respect people from other countries and other cultures and so on, how we get into their minds that this is a form of sexual apartheid, and that just as the Commonwealth stood up against racial apartheid, it has to stand up against this form of apartheid, and how you get that message over is a real quandary and quite a problem.
1969, you're 29 years of age, you've never been kissed, and...
no, I wouldn't put it quite that high.
Well, let me put it this way.
I had an auntie who used to insist on kissing me on the lips. It was Auntie Gloria. And she had been a communist, and she should have known better. But no, well, I certainly hadn't had lots of experience in that particular department.
You put it this way, that you expected that loneliness was the coinage in which the price of safety was to be paid, that you would be alone and sexless, is the way you put it. But in 1969, at the age of 29, this changed.
Well, it really changed in 68, because in 68 I met Demófilo Solera, who was my first lover, who was a Spaniard. He was very, very beautiful, and but then he walked out on me. Can you believe it? After 6 months. And I'd just taken him to New Zealand. But he was exploring the world, so he just was moving on to his next port of call, which was Melbourne. So he came down to Melbourne, and I was there left alone for 2 weeks. And then I met my partner, Jan, yes, on the 11th of February 1969. Very happy day for me.
In the Bottoms Up bar.
Did you have to mention the name of the bar?
It's in the book.
Yes, and we both remember the first words that I said. It's actually, whether you're straight or gay, singles bars are very frightening places. But Sydney bars have got a lot going for them. I mean, Crown Princess Mary met her prince in a bar in Sydney. And Zoe Phillips' daughter, I think, met her husband at a bar in Sydney. So watch out, the bars in Sydney have got a lot to answer for. But anyway, we met, and we went back to my apartment.
Well, let's get the chat-up line first. I mean, your opening, you thought Johann might be German by his accent, so your chat-up line involved asking him what he thought of Hitler's foreign minister, von Ribbentrop.
Well, it was unusual.
Well, it obviously worked.
As recorded in the book, he said, "Just my luck, I always meet the really mad people in these places." Anyway...
He was able to see past this and the orange jumper you were wearing in the middle of February.
Yes, it was the middle of a heat wave, and I turned up in an orange jumper and thick corduroy pants, which was another thing which was a bit off-putting, so he tells me now. I mean, I'd never been interested. I'm not all that interested in clothes, but anyway. So the long and short of it was that he said he knew a coffee bar nearby, because in those days the pubs shut at 10 o'clock, and I had to be up early the next morning because I was in court. So we walked past the Sydney El Alamein fountain towards a coffee shop, which he solemnly told me was just around the corner, and it had closed. It was finished, and so I did what any gentleman would then do. I said, well, come over to my place and at Kirby, and so he did, and we have been together since that night. 42 years. It's a great blessing in my life. And anybody who would deny another person the chance of such a blessing is not a kind person, not a kind person. And whether you're gay or straight, having a life's companion or having somebody who will put up with you and take you down a peg or two when you come home and really be kind and loving is a wonderful thing for your physical and mental health. It's good for society too. We've got to think about that in Australia at the moment. We've got to think about these things. What's in the interests of our community and of our people and our citizens.
You as you say, you very quickly set up house together, and it must become immediately apparent to your family the nature of your relationship. How did your family respond?
Well, I took Johan out within weeks to my family, because we would go there every Sunday night, and indeed until very recently I did that every Sunday night. When I was in Australia, we would go to my father's, and in her lifetime to my mother, and we would have dinner together. So they got to know Johan, and of course they put two and two together. It was not verbalised at first. But he is such an intelligent and charming person that they all got to like him, and he's also extremely practical, and so he can do things which none of their brilliant children can do. They all liked him. Everyone likes Johan. It's only me that some people can't stand. I mean, all the High Court justices loved Johan, and he's a very, very funny person. I rang him up just half an hour ago, and he still had me laughing at what he was saying, but it's too indiscreet to mention.
Okay, we're amongst friends.
Yes, but there are so many of them. But I've actually lived it's interesting to think of it, for 42 years in a Netherlands home. I mean, this is the wonderful thing about Australia now, that we are such a variety of people, and people of so many different cultures, now increasingly Asian cultures, and it is a wonderful thing to grow up with and live with people from cultures a bit different from your own. And it's very clean, everything's very clean and very ordered, and the food, well, it's very plain, but it's healthy, and now it's had to adapt to the fact that I've given away meat and chicken. So, but anyway,
I was going to ask you about that actually. I want to come back to your relationship, but because you say at one point in the book you described eating a hamburger. This is when you went on your James Dean pilgrimage, which is another chapter in the book. We won't go there now. And you said, when I used to eat such things. So you've given up meat. Is that an ethical decision or a health lifestyle decision?
Well, books are important. Books are important. Books can be life-changing. And I had to launch a book at the University of Sydney Law School on animal welfare in Australia and New Zealand. And it had more information than I really cared to know about the slaughter of animals, the corporatisation of the killing of animals, and the cruelty of it, and the live sheep and live animal exports. New Zealand doesn't do that. It's a very special Australian thing, and if we lose control over the slaughter of animals and they don't have distraction and stunning, it's really a very cruel business. They are sentient beings, so it's a moral choice. Johan says, he'll get over it, it's just his latest session, but I won't, and so we sort of have parallel course. It's like religion. He also is very anti-religious. Well, that's perhaps a bit too much. He doesn't understand why I worry about religion, but I know that on sexuality, religion is a big part of the problem, because the religions have got to the point now that they say, well, we can't deny the science. There is an orientation. Proportion of people are gay, but they just must do nothing about it. They must be celibate, which is such an irrational thing. Freud would concede that there was only one unnatural sexual arrangement, and that was celibacy. He said human beings are sexual beings, and tenderness and love and affection expressed in a sexual way is part of our hard wiring. And the Church's positions on this have to change, and will change one day.
Well, people might be surprised by the role of faith in your life, given how intolerant the established religions have been of your behaviour. You're a sinner.
Yes, and of my essential being. But you see, if you're brought up in a faith and a religion, and you really accept the fundamentals of it, you see, I think in Christianity the fundamental of it is a very loving religion, from a religious revolutionary. Jesus was a revolutionary. He came born in a manger and went in a donkey and was crucified in the end, and it's a very revolutionary story, but it's one that the fundamentals of it are of loving one another. And because I grew up always surrounded by love, I had a very loving upbringing, and therefore it comes naturally to you, and it fits in very nicely with what I was being taught in religion, and I don't want any old gent in a frock to take it away from me. I insist on hanging in there, but I get a very hard time at home over this. He says religions have always been rotten to women, to gays and to people of colour. And he says, give it away. They'll be happier, you'll be happier, I'll be happier.
Well, let's come back to your relationship. Did there come a point when you and Johan were going to your parents' home every Sunday? Did there come a point where actually someone said something and you actually talked about the nature of the relationship? Yes, my father did.
My father raised it, and so I naturally told him the truth. My mother never raised it, and everybody said, oh, don't tell Mum, she'd be mortified by it. But then when she was dying, I thought, I cannot finish my existence with my mother and not have been honest to her. And so I went into her bedroom within a week of her death, and I said, Mum, there's something I feel I should tell you. And so I did, and she stared at me with lovely green eyes, and she said, what do you take me for? You have been bringing Johan here for 31 years. So, anyway... But I don't think that story is unique to me. I think a lot of people go through that. And parents, if you're lucky, are wise and loving. And increasingly, parents understand that this is a proportion of their progeny, and it's part of nature. And if it exists in nature, it has a purpose. And I think the purpose is that you then spend your life not focused, in most cases, on a nuclear family, but on a wider range of interests and outreach and engagement with the community and society and the world. And certainly it exists, and it has a purpose. And anyway, that's how I got through it with my family. Everyone has their own little stories about this, and I think it's getting better and easier. And I get letters, many letters from parents saying how it has helped them and helped their children and so on, which is a good thing.
No one could read, well, I mean, my reading of this book, I was full of admiration for your bravery in various ways, and particularly the story about Zambia, which we might come to if we get a moment. But I wonder if sometimes you wish now you'd been less timid than you were. And I'm thinking, for example, of when you were sworn in on the High Court in 1996, and Johan was there in attendance, but no one said anything. No one acknowledged your relationship, including you. Do you regret that now? Do you wish you'd maybe been pushing a bit harder at the...
Yes, I do. I did say in the High Court, I thanked my parents and loved ones or something like that, and my sister-in-law went to Johan, saying it as much as to indicate, you're on, that's you. Yeah. But it was elliptical. I mean, everybody, because AIDS had come around in the 1980s, because I'd become involved in a lot of AIDS things, which was code language for my sexuality, everybody knew. But we were playing by the rules. You were expected to play by those rules. There is a question as to whether I would have been appointed to the High Court or to the Court of Appeal if at that time I had been open about my sexuality. I can just imagine the conversation. Well, he's very clever, but you know he's homosexual, and Australia isn't ready for a homosexual on the High Court, and there've always been gay judges and gay lawyers and gay everything, but the rule was you weren't candid about it because you didn't make people face the reality. And do I regret it? Yes, of course I regret it. But was it the price that had to be paid at that time? Yes, it was the price that had to be paid at that time.
Well, you do break rules, and I'll go. We're going to take questions from the audience in a second, but I wanted to come to your experiences in Zambia. You were invited to Zambia to address a group of judges and lawyers about HIV, AIDS, discrimination and the law. And Zambia is an extremely conservative country, and you chose in that conference to openly talk about the fact that you were gay to those judges.
I did it with a certain delicacy, because you have to respect that you've had a lot of time to work things out in your brain, but different people are at different stages of the journey, and you've got to be respectful of people, and I am respectful of people's journey and their different views and beliefs. But there was a bit of provocation in the meeting because there was this woman judge who started to attack the South Africans, and for having been, since Nelson Mandela became the president, they had changed and got rid of all the old laws against gays, and she started attacking them. I would have raised it anyway in due course, but I wouldn't perhaps have been quite so blunt. But I felt now, if I go on and reveal it later, I will be accused of not having been candid and transparent. So I just opened up and said where I was coming from, and there was a terrible shock in the audience. And the Chief Justice of Zambia said, if you went out there in the main street and said this, you would be arrested. And I said, well, Your Lordship, with great respect, as I understand the criminal code of Zambia, you can only be arrested if you do anything about it, not for just saying things. But anyway, but interestingly, I went back there a year and a half later, or 2 years later, and there on his wall in a pride of place was a big photograph of all the judges of Zambia and me at the AIDS conference. So, and he welcomed me back warmly. So it's a matter of planting ideas and planting amongst intelligent and good people. You can hope for quicker progress than amongst people who are sort of feel, well, God is saying this and therefore it's not negotiable, we're not going to talk about it, it's off the agenda. And this is really the challenge that our Prime Minister is going to face in Chogam in a few weeks' time. Because in the Commonwealth of Nations, the level of HIV is twice the level of the non-Commonwealth countries. We have double the rate of HIV in Commonwealth countries, and that cannot but be connected with the British difficulty with issues of sex and the criminal laws against sex workers and homosexuals and other sexual expression. So just for the sake of AIDS, we've got to be more candid and we've got to do things in the Commonwealth, and this is going to be just another challenge for the Prime Minister and for our representatives at the Chogam meeting in a few weeks' time.
Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. If anyone's got a question, if they haven't, I've got more. So feel free to put up your hand if you... Come on, don't be shy.
Or comments. You don't have to agree with any of this. And the book is very cheap. It's only $35. I mean, Allen and Unwin should have charged $55 and we could have shared the extra $10. Yes.
Thank you very much. You commented before that everybody needs a loving relationship, and you started to say that there was a problem in Australia amongst couples, relationships. I'd just like you to talk a bit more about that, please.
Well, I'm a bit careful about talking about the issue because I know that many people can't find a strong, loving relationship. And I don't want to say anything that belittles their lives and diminishes their integrity and their fullness and wholeness as a person. And there would be people, including, I would think, quite a few gay people, who really think this business of a relationship is a heterosexual model that is not really very suitable for gay people. And in truth, I think one thing that gays have to teach straight people is to be more forgiving and not to be so possessive about relationships, so that the book contains the story of how Demo, the Spaniard, rang me up and said, "Come down to Melbourne, I want to see you this weekend." So, and I said to Johan at the time, only one person could take me away from you. And my reproach was looking in his eyes and seeing how hurt he was. But he was still there at the end of the weekend when I came back, and he's still there now. And so the talk of cheating and talk of sort of walking out on a person because of a sexual encounter is, I think, something most gay relationships would not do. You would look at a bigger picture. And I think this may be something that is true of relationships generally now, whether heterosexual or homosexual. But however that may be, I do think that not everybody has a close and loving and long relation. Not everybody wants it. A lot of people who want it can't find it. And therefore you've got to be careful not to say, well, you're not legitimate unless you've got it. And I don't say that. But if you do have it, it is a great blessing. And in the book is a story of how one of the perils of public speaking now is that you go out and everybody you sort of celebrates you and so on, and then you don't get anything to eat. And then you go home, and fortunately, you know, Jan will put on some soup or something, and that is really what LOVE is about. So anyway, That is my response. But I am very respectful of the fact that every one of us is an individual, a single spark, and every one of us has to find our own journey, and what is right for one isn't necessarily right for the other. But all I can say is I've been very lucky, and I've been especially lucky that I've been kept laughing all the time. I mean, I think laughter is such a wonderful boon, and the people of the Netherlands, they're very sarcastic, but they're very, very witty, and they play on words, and that's been a great blessing.
Okay, further questions? Or while you're... Oh, there we go. Someone's got their hand up.
Just on a different subject, Madam Michael, I was just wondering what your view of the debate about climate change and the level of debate that's been going on.
Well, I don't know. I'm like, I suppose, a lot of people. I'm a bit confused about all this. It's quite a big issue in the Commonwealth. I was on this so-called eminent persons group. I'm very uncomfortable with that title, but the Eminent Persons Group has prepared a report which is going to the CHOGM meeting in a few weeks' time. And one of the major topics in the Commonwealth countries is climate change and water levels, because 31 of the states of the Commonwealth are small island states, and many of them, like Kiribati and countries in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, are threatened by the rising levels of the water. So I feel something has to be done. Something is urgent. Certainly, countries like Kiribati, it's existential. Unless something can be done, they will be wiped out, and then we'll really have boat people coming to Australia. And so the question is, what should we do about it? Can we do things alone? If everybody waits for others to do things, will anything be done? Can we take steps? What does science say on the matter? My understanding is that 98% of science says we've got a big problem and it's caused by global warming and fossil fuels, and we've got to target that and move into other non-fossil fuel sources of income, which are going to sources of energy, which are going to run out anyway pretty soon. So I'm just Mr. Average on this. I feel something has to be done. I feel Australia can't wait for everyone else. I feel we should, as a relatively prosperous country, be willing to take a lead. I really disapprove of endeavours of some of our media to present as a genuine debate what appears not to be a genuine debate amongst authentic scientists. And I just feel that this is a matter on which we've got to have leadership. And leadership is a very, very scarce commodity at the moment in the highly volatile Australian political scene. So, did everyone hear that question? Well, the question is, I think, would I like to talk about the least wonderful thing that's in my life? Well, I suppose the least wonderful thing, you can imagine, it was an attack on me in the Senate by Senator Heffernan, the like of which had never happened to any judge or any justice of the High Court before. And the most horrible aspect of it was that I was sitting that week in a case concerning effluent. It was a case of negligence about whether oysters were infected with effluent in the Brisbane waters. So whilst this great saga was going on around my life and so on, I was just having to sit there day by day in this tedious case whilst it was all going on outside. And in the book, I think I recount that when it happened, I tried to ring Johan because he'd driven down the night before. The justices of the High Court had entertained the British High Commissioner and his wife, and we'd all had dinner whilst this speech was being made. And then we'd gone home not knowing it. I'd got to my chambers at about 6 or 5:30 a.m. in the morning as usual, and the ABC rang me, and I didn't know what they were talking about, and they said, well, we'll fax you the news story on page 3 of the Sydney Morning Herald. But because I knew that the notion that I had used Commonwealth cars was so ridiculous, I thought people would come to their senses very quickly, but they didn't, and it was a very unpleasant week. So you asked for the least lovely. Well, in personal terms, losing a parent and suffering various personal things is more important. But in public terms, that wasn't a nice look, and it especially wasn't a nice look for Jan. Senator Heffernan made a habit when we were at Parliament House, when we would go up for the swearing in of a new Governor-General or of a new government. That's the way the justices go along, and they sit in the Senate and so on. He would always make a point of coming over to shake hands. And I would always shake his hand. That was how I was brought up. Jan was much more hesitant about it. He was not deeply into the handshaking. And Senator Heffernan would say to him, won't you shake hands with the devil? And Jan would say, better the devil I know than the devil I don't. But so that wasn't a good week, wasn't a good time, but fortunately it was all over pretty quickly, and Senator Heffernan apologised, and he was dismissed as a minister, and so you put it behind you. It's very important in life not to carry grudges, not to go through life thinking that person did this to me at that time and I hate them. You've got to put it all behind you, otherwise it eats into you and you become the prisoner of the person instead of getting rid of it out of your mind.
One final question. We have one in the middle there. Yeah.
You said that you may not have been appointed to the High Court if you hadn't been playing the game. Would you encourage young people, especially early in their career, to be out?
Well, I certainly would, and I don't know that would be a factor now. I would think that if a person was gay, I would hope that would not be a consideration for governments. And the truth is that I've now gone to quite a few welcomes to judges in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, for example, and the people there, and in the Federal Court of Australia, and the newly appointed judge acknowledges his or her partner, who is a same-sex partner. So things have shifted. The ground has moved. It's a different world, and it'll get better and better. Every year is a new improvement. But it only happens when we begin to know people and not to sort of fear the unknown. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important for people like me to be open, because then people can make their own judgment, not based on a stereotype, but based on a real living human being who has faults and weaknesses, but is also has some strengths, most especially a very good choice of partner.
Okay, I'll remind you that if you'd like a book signed in beautiful copperplate, then Michael Kirby will be available to sign books at the back of the room. They're also for sale there. Please join me in thanking Justice Michael Kirby.